Hi, my name is Jason Adrians with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, and this is a presentation on our saltwater finfish management. We go over some of the main things we do in the finfish program. Of course, all these are done under our department's charge, which is to manage, conserve, and promote the wise utilization of Louisiana's renewable fish resources for the benefit of current and future generations. And we do that a couple of different ways. We monitor our fish stocks. One way is with our fishery independent sampling, which are the samples we go out and collect as a department. We monitor fishing, and we do that by collecting samples both from the commercial fishery and the recreational fishery. We'll do that at fish houses, dealers, docks, and of course, we collect samples during our lacreel surveys at recreational launch sites. All these data that we collect, we use them to conduct stock assessments, which gives us a status and a health of our stocks. And then we'll put those together. We'll review those. We send those out to outside bodies for review. And we also help other states review their stock assessments. Once we have a stock assessment for our species, we'll make management recommendations based on that biological data that we've put together. And of course, that may or may not lead to management measures, which are those rules we make through our Wildlife and Fisheries Commission. So, how do we monitor stocks through our fisheries independent sampling? We have the same sampling that's been in place roughly since 1986. It's undergone a few revisions over time based on spatial and statistical analysis and management need, and some notable timeframes when we adjusted the sampling was in 2010, 2013, and 2015. And we use different types of gears to target various life stages of those estuarine dependent saltwater fish. So the first gear I'll review is our seine sampling. That's the sampling you see the picture of there. And we use that to capture young of the year fishes. So those fish that are in their first year of life, but haven't necessarily reached their first birthday. It provides us with growth and movement data, seasonality of fishes. It gives us some ecological and community structure information. And that's conducted monthly in each of our basins. And we conduct about 1,260 of those samples per year. We also have our gill net sampling, and you can see the pictures below. This captures juvenile, subadult, and adult fish. We use it to look at the year class strength of those fish, size and distribution of those fish, movement of those fish, and the relative abundance. We also are able to collect some ancillary life history information. We'll be able to take ages and sex of those fish as to whether they're male or female and their current reproductive state, whether they're mature or they're developing, getting ready to spawn, information such as that. The gillnet sampling is conducted twice monthly from April through September and once monthly from October through March in each of our basins. And that's approximately 972 total samples per year. And I'll note that each gillnet has 5 different size panels. So each of those 972 samples is comprised of 5 different sizes. So that's closer to 5,000 total samples when accounting for the different panels in the gear. Our trammel net sampling is another way we collect data. This gives us data on relative abundance, size, distribution, standing crop, and movement, as well as that ancillary life history information I mentioned earlier. We sample these from October through March in each basin, and that's about a total of 270 samples per year. And you can see that gear below. So how do we select the sites that we sample? Our seine sites, we sample all of our available sites in each basin every month. Our gill net and trammel net sites, we draw monthly a random number of sites from our total number of fixed stations, and that's a specific number of locations that we draw for in each coastal study area. And that's based upon a statistical analysis of what's needed to manage that resource in each of those basins. The map here, I'll leave this up for a few seconds. This is where all our sampling locations are throughout the state by our basins. You can see there in the bottom left the type of sample it is, and some of these overlap, as you'll notice some of the sites that have an X inside the circle or have other notations inside them. So another way we check the status of stocks is we monitor harvest through our fisheries dependent sampling. That's those samples we collect dockside from either a commercial operation or recreational sites. Prior to 2014, we used the Marine Recreational Information Program, or MRIP, to collect recreational data. Since 2014, we've used LaCreel. And as an example, we surveyed almost 30,000 anglers in 2021. We use trip ticket data to monitor commercial landings. We'll also take biological sampling from both the recreational and commercial fisheries. That's length of fish, weight, and ages by collecting the otoliths, those hard parts that are in the head of the fish. We can cut those and age those like rings on a tree. And as an example, we collected almost 8,400 recreational otoliths in 2021 and almost 1,900 commercial otoliths in 2021. So the stock assessments we conduct. So we've collected all this data. When and how do we conduct stock assessments? We have legislative mandates to conduct assessments on black drum, sheep's head, striped mullet, and southern flounder every 5 years. The Wildlife and Fisheries Commission has the authority to set management benchmarks for black drum, sheep's head, and southern flounder. We generally update the spotted sea trout and red drum stock assessments as needed or requested by the Wildlife and Fisheries Commission, but there is no required timeline for those two species. However, we continuously monitor all our fish stocks. Red drum has another added layer of management in that it's co-managed between the states and the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council. That stock is managed to a particular escapement rate, and escapement simply means the number of juvenile fish that make it out of the estuaries and out of the recreational fishery into the offshore spawning stock. And that management limit is a 30% escapement rate. And then in those assessments, all the data we talked about previously, that's both fisheries independent and dependent, factors into those stock assessments. Our sampling data, which allows us to generate those indices of abundance for our fish species. The landings, both recreational and commercial, allow us to gauge the removals of those fish by fishing effort. Our age and growth data goes into the assessment to help us determine the structure of the population. And then those other life history parameters, the sex of the fish, when they're spawning, those sorts of things all factor into a stock assessment. How many eggs are produced by a female, biological data along with landings data. So here's an example of some of the data. Once we've conducted a stock assessment, here's an example of some fishery dependent data. The top graph you see here is landings of striped mullet over time. And you can see the history of the landings, and the stock assessment will give a predicted value, and the observed value is actually the value that we saw through trip ticket landings. And you can see in this example, they correlate very well. The bottom two graphics you see are an example of the age structure of striped mullet that are landed. This is in the commercial data. You can see from 0 to 7 years old, kind of the age structure of the harvest. What is an index of abundance? Here's an example from our GillNet survey data. This example is for sheepshead. This is from the data we collect in our GillNets, and you can see the index in gray. The gray line there is the relative abundance of that species scaled to 1. So if 1 could be considered an average, you can see where that index falls above or below 1 over time. And this is a measure of the relative abundance of that species in our GillNet sampling. Another example of outputs we get from a stock assessment are a fishing mortality rate. And in this example for black drum, we also show an escapement rate. If you recall, when I discussed escapement for red drum, we can also calculate that for black drum, which has a somewhat similar life history. So you can see here in that top graphic, which shows fishing mortality, the rate over time, you can see a target and a limit. And the idea with fishing mortality in this graphic on top is to be somewhere around that yellow line, but below the red line. If you look at the escapement graphic below, you can see where that stock is relative to the limit and the target. And in this graphic, once again, you prefer to fish around the target, but in that graphic, you want to be above the red limit line. So these are all types of outputs we get from an assessment, things that help us manage a stock. Here's an example of another output. This one is for southern flounder. This is a measure of the spawning stock biomass of that species. And you can see relative to the target, which is where you want to manage to, and the limit, which is the place in the stock you don't want to be below. So you can see here, southern flounder is at or below the limit. And if you recall, we had some recent regulatory action on southern flounder to close the fishery in the fall from mid-October through November. And that is to help some of these female southern flounder escape the fishery, get into the offshore population and spawn. So what is the current status of some of our assessed commercial stocks? Southern flounder, that stock is currently overfished, but it's not undergoing overfishing. So overfished means the stock is below the limit. Overfishing is simply a measure of too many fish being removed. Currently, there aren't too many flounder being removed. However, the population is too low. Unfortunately, we had to establish management measures because one of the few things we can control is that removal of flounder. And the idea with the closure is to allow more of those females to enter the spawning population, hopefully rebuilding that spawning stock biomass and getting that population closer to the target and above the limit. Sheepshead, that stock is currently not overfished or undergoing overfishing, so it's considered healthy. Striped mullet, the same thing. The stock is currently not overfished or undergoing overfishing, so it's considered a healthy stock. Black drum is the same. It's currently not overfished or undergoing overfishing. And Gulf menhaden, that stock is not overfished or undergoing overfishing. If you have any questions about what you've seen in this presentation, please find a wildlife and fisheries biologist. They can direct you to the right person or contact your local Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries office. Thank you.